Okay na po.
Good afternoon, everyone. So we're here to discuss about the drowning. So drowning. Next page po. So what is drowning? Drowning is suffocation by immersion in a liquid, usually water. Water closing over the victim's mouth and nose cuts off the body's supply of oxygen. Deprived of oxygen, the victim stops struggling, loses consciousness, and gives up the remaining tidal air in his lungs. Next slide po. So the pathophysiology of drowning. The most important factors contributing to morbidity and mortality from drowning are hypoxemia and acidosis, as well as the multi-organ effects of these processes. Central nervous system damage can result from hypoxemia during drowning or can result from arrhythmias, persistent lung injury, reperfusion injury, or multiple organ dysfunction, especially long-term tissues hypoxia. Periods of involuntary laryngospasm occur due to the presence of fluid in the oropharynx or larynx. When the victim's airway is below the surface of the body, fluid after the first breath hold. At this point, the victim is unable to breathe air, causing oxygen starvation and carbon dioxide retention. As the blood's oxygen tension decreases, laryngeal spasms stop and the victim may choke, hyperventilate, and suck in different amounts of fluid. This leads to additional hypoxemia. Also, Donata et al. Reviewed the autopsy of 578 individuals who had apparently drowned and found evidence of water in the lungs of 98.6% of those studied. So as they noted, active ventilation while submerged is required to aspirate water, as water does not passively flow into the lungs once the victim is dead. So depending upon the degree of hypoxemia and resulting acidotic change in acid-base balance, the person may develop myocardial dysfunction and electrical instability, cardiac arrest, and central nervous system ischemia. Asphyxia leads to relaxation of the airway, which permits the lungs to take in water in many individuals, although most patients aspirate less 4 milliliter or per kilogram of fluid. So fluid aspiration of at least 11 milliliter per kilogram is required for alterations in blood volume to occur, and aspiration of more than 22 ml kilogram is required before significant electrolyte changes to develop. Ingestion of large volumes of fresh water rather than aspiration is the likely cause of clinically significant electrolyte disturbances, such as hyponatremia in children after drowning. Next page po. So this is the mechanism of hypoxia in submersion injury. So approximately 10 to 15% of individuals maintain tight laryngospasm until cardiac arrest occurs and inspiratory efforts have ceased. These victims do not aspirate by any appreciable fluid. So this is referred to drowning, as we can see in the chart, the involuntary gasp, the laryngospasm, and then dry wet, and then mapupunta na sa brain injury while nalulunod na yung tao. So dry refers to drowning secondary to airway. Wet refers to drowning secondary to aspiration, as well as passive collection of fluid into the airway. So in young children suddenly immersed in cold water in negative 20 degrees Celsius, the mammalian diving reflex may occur and produce apnea, bradycardia, and vasoconstriction of non-essential vascular beds with shunting of blood to the coronary and cerebral circulation. Next po. So here are the effects of drowning. So pulmonary effects. In pulmonary effects, When submerged, the target organ is the lungs, aspirating only 13 milligrams per kilogram of liquid, significantly reduces gas exchange. Damage to other systems is primarily secondary to hypoxia and ischemic acidosis. Additional central nervous system damage may result from concomitant head or spinal cord injury. The period of hypoxia and hypoxemia is initially limited by periods of hypopnea or apnea and may resolve after initial rescue efforts. Patients with prolonged hypoxia tend to aspirate alveolar fluid, resulting in vagus-mediated pulmonary vasoconstriction, hypertension, and fluid-induced bronchospasm. Fresh water moves rapidly through the alveolar capillary membrane into the microcirculation. Fresh water is mostly hypotonic compared to plasma and causes damage to alveolar surfactants. Degradation of surfactants leads to alveolar stability, atelectasis, and decreased compliance with marked ventilation or perfusion mismatch. Up to 75% of blood flow can circulate through the lungs under hypoventilation. So, in salt water, which is hyperosmolar, increases the osmotic gradient and therefore draws fluid into the alveoli, diluting surfactant. So the protein-rich fluid then exudes rapidly into the alveoli and pulmonary interstitium. Compliance is reduced, the alveolar capillary basement membrane is damaged directly, and shunting occurs. This results in rapid development of serious hypoxia. So the distinction between submersion fluid type is primarily academic and mostly connotes epidemiologic significance. Hypoxia serves as the primary insult and with alveolar aspiration culminates in surfactant disruption, alveolar collapse, and the recruitment intrapulmonary shunting. It also increased the pulmonary vascular resistance and ventilation mismatch. This process results in acute lung injury and acute respiratory distress syndrome. So, the pulmonary hypertension may be exacerbated by inflammatory mediator release. In a minor percentage of patients, aspiration of vomitus, sand, spit, and stagnant water and sewage may result in occlusion of bronchi, bronchospasm, pneumonia, abscess formation, and inflammatory damage to alveolar capillary membranes. Also, the post-obstructive pulmonary edema following laryngospasm and hypoxic neuronal injury with resultant neurogenic pulmonary edema may also occur. So, commonly, this edematous non-compliant lungs may be further compromised by ventilator-associated lung injury. Newer modes of ventilation, including high-frequency oscillatory ventilation and airway pressure release ventilation, or an open lung approach that limits tidal volumes to 6 to 8 milliliter per kilogram while using positive and expiratory pressure to support optimal respiratory compliance can help support oxygenation and ventilation with less risk of valley than associated with older methods of ventilation. So, when we say pulmonary, there is pneumonia. Pneumonia is a rare consequence of submersion in injury and is more common with submersion in stagnant, warm, and fresh water. So uncommon pathogens including Aeromonas, Burkholderia, and Sudaleschieria cause a disproportionate percentage of cases of pneumonia. Because pneumonia is uncommon early in the course of treatment of submersion injuries, the use of prophylactic antimicrobial therapy has not proven to be of any benefit. Next slide po. So, central nervous system effects. Hypoxic ischemic brain injury is a precursor to drowning-related asphyxiating cardiac arrest. The extent of CNS damage remains a major determinant of subsequent survival and long-term morbidity in the case of drowning. The child loses consciousness 2 minutes after diving. Permanent brain damage usually occurs after 46 minutes. Most surviving children are found within 2 minutes of diving. Most dying children are found within 10 minutes. Areas of increased risk in the brain are metabolically active subcortical tissue and perfused watershed tissue. Overall brain damage occurs in cases of hypoxemia and low flow conditions that result in energy deprivation, lipid peroxidation, free radical production, inflammation, and release of excitotoxic neurotransmitters. Nerve and glial function is impaired. Asphyxiating heart failure causes selective damage to neurons as well as the development of microinfarction. So the primary central nervous system injury is initially associated with tissue hypoxemia and ischemia. If the period of hypoxia and ischemia is brief, or if the person is a very young child who rapidly develops core hypothermia, primary injury may be limited and the patient may recover with minimal neurologic sequel even after more prolonged immersion. So in contrast, the drowning that is associated with prolonged hypoxia and or ischemia is likely to lead to both significant primary injury and secondary injury, especially in older patients who cannot rapidly achieve core hypothermia. So the secondary injury are the reperfusion, sustained acidosis, cerebral edema, hyperglycemia, release of excitatory neurotransmitters, seizures, hypotension, and also impaired cerebral autoregulation. So, although cerebral edema is a common consequence of prolonged submersion, retrospective reviews and animal studies have not demonstrated any benefit from the use of intracranial pressure monitoring with diffuse axonal injury. However, as submersion injuries may be associated with trauma, focal or persistent neurologic deficit may indicate mass lesions or other injury amenable to surgical intervention. Autonomic instability is common following severe traumatic, hypoxic, or ischemic brain injury. These patients often present with signs and symptoms of hyperstimulation of the sympathetic nervous system. These are the tachycardia, hypertension, tachypnea, diaphoresis, agitation, and also the muscle rigidity. Next slide po. So cardiovascular effects. Drowning can lead to acute asphyxiation, which is caused by hypoxemia before ischemia develops. This scenario is the result of the initial cessation of gas exchange, followed by an exacerbation of hypoxemia and a possible heart attack. Hypoxemia is a serious crime. Hypovolemia may result from fluid loss due to increased capillary permeability. Severe hypotension may occur during and after the initial period of resuscitation, especially when rewarming is accompanied by vasodilation. It is important to remember that in many patients, hypothermia develops from prolonged exposure to water rather than complete immersion in cold water. So the myocardial dysfunction may result from ventricular arrhythmias, pulseless electrical activity, and asystole due to hypoxemia. The hyperthemia, acidosis, or electrolyte abnormalities. So in addition, hypoxemia may directly damage the myocardium, decreasing our cardiac output. So pulmonary hypertension may result from the release of pulmonary inflammatory mediators. increasing right ventricular afterload and thus decreasing both pulmonary perfusion and left ventricular preload. However, although cardiovascular effects may be severe, they are usually transient, unlike severe central nervous system injury. So the other effects of drowning is the clinical course may be complicated by multi-organ system failures resulting from prolonged hypoxia, acidosis, rhabdomyolysis disease, acute tubular necrosis, or the treatment modalities. So the disseminated intravascular coagulation, hepatic and renal insufficiency, metabolic acidosis, and GI injuries must be considered and appropriately managed. Next slide. So can you drown in inch of water? Yes, you can drown in less than 2 inches, 6 centimeters of water. That means drowning can happen in a sink, toilet bowl, fountains, buckets, inflatable pools, or small bodies of standing water around your home, such as beaches filled with rainwater. And while sinasabi dito na you can drown in an inch of water, you can also die from drinking cold water that we will discuss later.
So, good afternoon po. And my name is Jeremy John Alba, and I'm going to discuss the how drowning related crime scenes are investigated. So, drowning, a crime scene investigation. Investigating death associated with natural bodies of water can be difficult due to the different elements present in the scene. Not all water-related deaths can be presumed to be drownings, and other factors such as water and weather temperature extremes, drug intoxication, or natural disease may be sufficient enough to be the cause of death and otherwise preclude drowning. So, before I start my discussion, may gusto lang sabihin na fact. In 2020, accidental drowning registered in the Philippines is considered ninth when heart diseases remains the main cause of death with 105,114 deaths according to Philippines Statistics Authority. Even though hindi siya ganun ka-common sa Philippines, marami pa rin namamatay na tao due to drowning. Next slide po. So drowning. Drowning is an intentional, in the world, drowning is considered to be the 7% of all injury-related death. So in the United States, nearly 4,000 deaths are recorded, and it is considered as the 10th most common injury-based death. In the Philippines, in 2018, World Health Organization published that drowning death reached 5,633 or 0.92% of total death with a rate of 5.45 per 100,000 of population, making the Philippines rank 60 sa mga namamatayan due to drowning. So, ano po yung drowning equation? Drowning equation is created by Dr. Joseph H. Davis for pre-autopsy information. Drowning equation is an initial consideration and can only be answered by a carefully correlated police and medical examiner. So ito po yung mga questions na binubuo natin as intuition, especially as police investigators, and medical examiners. Ito po yung mga question na, was the victim alive or dead before entering the water? Nalunod ba talaga yung victim? And why or how the victim get into the water in the first place? And bakit hindi na kayang mabuhay ng biktima dun sa tubig kung saan siya namatay? So this question made the pre-autopsy information and drowning equation, quote unquote, a more than an exercise of autopsy. Bakit? Since the body may offer clues as to whether or not the victim drowned, and kung nalunod man sila, bakit? It makes an intensive ongoing correlative investigation of both police and the pathologist to correct their opinions and to show the answer dun sa mga tanong na yun. So ano nga bang laman sa mga ano ba yung laman sa pre-autopsy information? Ano ba yung hinahanap natin? So pre-autopsy information is necessary kasi this includes decedent identification, location of the body, condition of the body, type and extent of recovery effort, is if resuscitation was applied, kung meron mang, and presence or absence of any life preserver. And all of this relies on the witness testimony or account. Next page po. So ito po yung investigation process. So syempre, as an investigator, first things first, we should establish the identity of the body. So this leads to information about the corpse. Example, yung medical history nila, kung may psychiatric history ba sila, or kung may history sila ng substance use or substance abuse. So ang laman nito ay yung documentation of findings. Like I said, yung body positioning, yung relativity of immersion, submersion, and drowning, and the environmental hazards. So ano po ba ang pinagkaiba ng immersion sa submersion? Ang immersion, siya ay water gets under the face. So ang example niya, yung isang tao, pero siyang, ang ikinamatay niya ay nilunod siya sa isang bucket of water, pero siyang nalunod sa bowl. Katulad nga sabi ni Richan kanina na ang bata, or we can drown in a 1-inch water. So pwedeng yung dun sa 1-inch water na yun, pwede siyang possible na immersion death. While submersion, in the other hand, is the airway goes below the surface. So paano nangyayari yun? Ang submersion, ang pagkamatay ng isang tao, ay dun sa dagat or sa mga bodies of water, sa pool, yung mga ganun. So, ang importance ng immersion at submersion kasi yung sa body position ng isang tao, pwede nating malaman kung ano yung ikinamatay niya, kung ano yung ikinamatay niya. Whether it was submerged or kung na-resuscitated siya ng bystander, na naging dahilan kung bakit siya na-move or kung bakit na-repositioned yung katawan niya. So, kasama rin sa establishing identity is the presence, the condition, and state of the body, and kung meron mang naka-attach or may na-detach dun sa katawan ng victim. So, requires coordinated efforts and expertise of multiple agencies. So, bakit? Kasi kaya it requires coordinated efforts. Marami kasi ang pupunta dun sa isang crime scene. Hindi lang naman basta investigators ang pupunta dun. Pupunta rin ang emergency technical responders, pupunta ang medical first responders, medical-legal death investigators, forensic scientists, pathologists, na they would work all together to gather enough information about the crime scene. So next po ay assessment of vital signs. and injuries. As a human, and as our human nature and instinct natin pag may nakikita tayong taong nangangailangan ng tulong, syempre tutulungan natin. And when it comes to drowning, lalo na pag marunong tayo mag-CPR, instinct natin na kung may may naghahanap ng tulong, we will try to revive the body. So, bakit kailangan siya sa investigation process? Kasi may mga times na yung mga nalulunod, may mga times na pwede pa silang i-survive kahit na na-drown. Kahit na let's say na-drowned na sila, may chance pa na pwede silang mabuhay. And in 2019, an estimated of 236,000 people died from drowning, making drowning a major public health problem worldwide, sabi po ng World Health Organization. It remains a leading cause of preventable death in the US, and CPR can be utilized as 66% of nearly drowned children are revived successfully, according to Barra. So, ang ikinakamatay ng tao minsan sa drowning ay hindi gawa ng tubig. Minsan, ang ikinakamatay nila ay anoxic brain injury due to the brain's lack of oxygen. And in a case of cold water drowning, victims can be brought back or survive within the 2 hours interval if and only if the right steps are applied. So documentation and indication of criminality. Where law enforcers and that investigation arrives, syempre, ang first job nila is to determine whether there's foul play in the incident. Since sa sobrang common ng drowning, minsan view na lang siya as accident kahit na may mapapansin tayo na foul play or somewhat mukhang hindi siya accident. So, bakit parang laging view siya as accident? Kasi yung homicidal drowning, they are difficult to prove. Ito ay nagde-derive dahil yung sa evidences ay mas madali bang mawala. And kung ipo-prove naman sa court of law, maghahanap yung prosecutor or yung judge ng strong evidence na mag-prove na homicidal drowning yun. Tulad nga ng, di ba, pag nalulunod tayo, tendency sa katawan ng tao, pumasok yung water, especially in the lungs, papasok. Pero hindi siya nagpo-prove na namatay yung tao dun sa tubig sa lungs or namatay yung tao dahil sa tubig. Unrelated pa po yung cause of death, which are possibly pwedeng heart attack, pwedeng na-stroke yung tao, pwede ring allergic reaction or other reasonable possibilities. Kung signs of struggles and other injuries are to be indicated that a person was held, tulad po na sabi ni Dr. Jonathan Agnes, it would be hard to kill an adult by drowning without leaving behind clues from struggles. So, maintenance of open line communication. Ito po yung pinaka-important when investigating. Kasi when you maintain open line communication, mababawasan and ma-avoid natin yung mga leaks or any misinformation na magbabago or maggugulo dun sa process. It is also important that we are in order to practice proper collection, preservation, interpretation of known evidence and information. So, nakalimutan kong sabihin, dun sa assessment of vital signs and injuries, may nabasa ako na for every 5 minutes, nataas ang fatality ng isang tao. Like from 0 to 5 minutes, 10% ang fatality ng victim. 6 to 10 minutes, 56%. 11 to 25 minutes, 88%. And greater than 25 minutes, automatic mamamatay yung tao due to drowning. So next slide po. So what are the protocols to be followed? Next slide po. So approach of the pathologist. So determine and consider the different diagnosis. So ano po ba yung different diagnosis? When approaching investigations of bodies recovered from water, ang mga different diagnosis na titingnan natin ay kung namatay ba yung tao due to drowning, death due to injuries or other factors before entering the water, death due to natural causes during immersion such as sudden fatal arrhythmia or cardiac arrest, or due to injury during immersion, or other factors such as hyperthermia during the time of immersion. So when it comes to immersion, there are external evidence to be noticed, such as skin slippage. It may commence within a matter of minutes following immersion in warm water, but this may extend to many hours or days in cold water. Immersion in cold water can result in the development of cutis anserine, goose flesh. This cause is contraction of the erector pilae, which are attached to the hair follicles. This cause dimpling of the skins as there are the cause such as rigor mortis. The finding has to be regarded with some circumception. So, ang kasunod po natin ay observation of the estimation post-mortem interval. When it comes to the estimation of post-mortem intervals, may mapapansin tayo sa katawan ng isang tao pag na-drown siya or may in contact of water. Like absence of wrinkling of the skin of hand. Ito ay nangyayari less than a few hours. Wrinkling of the skin of hand and feet 1 to 3 days. Early putrefaction of exposed skin 4 to 12 days. Marbling of the skin with gaseous distortion of the face and abdomen 14 to 28 days. And liquefaction of and early skeletonizing for 2 months. These observations are extremely variable and may be modified by environmental factors such as water contamination, water flow, temperature, and animal interference. So immersion other than drowning. Sudden immersion in cold water of person who are intoxicated with alcohol is recognized as a cause of sudden death, with the mechanism possibly related to vasovagal inhibition or other fatal cardiac arrhythmias. So autopsy observation. When observing water-related death, there may be no abnormal findings in the bodies of water or the bodies found in water, sorry. This would leads to an unexpected sudden death. Kaya nga po natin nasasabi na accident yung pagkamatay ng tao due to drowning kasi may mga times na wala talaga tayong mapapansin or walang makikita na proof or evidence na pinatay yung tao. And if these victims were alive when they entered the water, their death is likely due to a primary cardiac event, not as the result of submersion precluding respiration. Tulad nga po ng sabi ko kanina, hindi naman basta-basta natin hindi natin basta-basta sasabihin na ay namatay yan dahil nalunod. Ay namatay yan dahil nahulog sa tubig. Kasi malay mo, namatay pala yung tao gawa na stroke bigla. Wala siyang kasama. Tapos nahulog siya dun sa, sabihin natin sa tulay or nahulog siya dun sa ilog. Kaya ang hirap niya i-investigate. When sa dry drowning naman, dry drowning is not an appropriate label sa mga ganong situation kasi namatay yung tao sa fatal cardiac arrhythmia or hindi siya respiratory impairment secondary to immersion and submersion. When it comes to the lungs of the victim, 'di ba nga sabi ko kanina na pwedeng mapuno yung lungs natin with fluids or water. As a rule, mas mabigat yung lungs ng mga nalulunod kaysa sa normal na tao. Pero hindi pa rin siya nagre-reflect na nalunod siya. So, hindi pa rin niya nare-reflect na malay mo namatay yung tao dun sa heart attack, namatay yung tao sa allergic reaction. Kaya kailangan natin i-approach ito with seriousness and with proper knowledge. Since the appearance of the lungs may be altered rin at the same time kasi may mga tao naman na magsi-CPR or mga taong nagtangka na i-resuscitate yung natlunod. Kaya kailangan rin natin i-take note yung mga subtle changes or subtle information na magbabago dun sa point of view natin in the crime scene. So as a following experience are of proven value in forensic laboratory experience, a definitive diagnosis of immersion and submersion can be helped by the identification of diatoms. These are organisms with silica shell, which is resistant to both decomposition and concentrated acid. The principle of technique is the digestion of lungs and or bone marrow, and then microscopic examination of the precipitate of the fluid. It is of paramount importance that a control sample is obtained from environment in which the immersion incident occur. Centrifuge lung edema fluid can be subjected to toxicological analysis. Ito po yung centrifuge lung edema. Siya po yung build up fluid in the body's tissue. Ang fatal immersion in swimming pools presents diagnostic problems to interpretation fluid in the lungs. Kasi syempre, pag sa swimming pool naman may mga certain elements siya na kailangan natin i-interpret para mas madali nating ma-discover kung ano ba talaga yung ikinamatay ng isang tao. Next page po. So these are the essential steps to be recognized whenever we investigate water-related incidents. So taking prompt emergency action, provide first aid, makes things first, safe. Prompt reporting within the organization and to other agency where necessary, securing the scene, deciding on the level of investigation required and establishing terms of reference and allocating responsibilities in the investigation process, tapos gathering evidence. Next page po. Analyzing and integrating the evidence, identifying gaps in the evidence, and seeking further evidence and clarification by study previous events that may be relevant, developing and testing hypotheses, generating conclusion and recommendation, and communicating recommendation and tracking closure with stakeholder. So, itong essential steps po ay para lang siyang yung ginagawa ng mga pathologists, ng mga death investigators when it comes to investigating such incidents. Sila po yung parang principles nila whether they'll take the incident seriously or not. So next page po. So who was Michael De Guzman? Itong case na to ay isang case na napaka-interesting and napaka-engaging at the same time. So bakit? Si Michael De Guzman po ay isang geologist na nag-lead sa greatest gold fraud in the world. Naggumamit lang po sila ng barya para makakuha ng 6 billion US dollar. Michael De Guzman was born in February 14, 1956. And he is the exploration manager of briex mineral. So Michael De Guzman followed in his father's footsteps, studying geology at Adamson University. By 1977, he was hired straight out of school by Benguet Corporation, a large gold mining firm. Within 10 years, he was promoted to head up the company's geology department. In those years, De Guzman was a good employee and seen as generous with subordinates. And his integrity was solid, and his life consisted of work and family, which soon grew to include 6 children with his wife, Tess. Many Filipino geologists sought bigger paychecks in Indonesia, where much of the inhospitable rainforest was terra incognito, or unknown territory for miners. In 1990, Pelsart Resources fired De Guzman for using company fund to buy food and furniture for a woman. And 2 years after Pelsart's incident, De Guzman and longtime colleague John Felderhoff were prospecting for an Australian firm in a remote area known as Busang on Borneo Island. So next slide po. So briex. Ang briex po ay yung company na pinagtatrabuhan ni Michael De Guzman. This was founded by David Walsh, a man looking to put some romance into the junior mining companies where he ran from his Calgary basement. And by 1993, De Guzman was heading up the site for Walsh briex Mineral as the company exploration manager in Indonesia. So, yung briex company ang nag-manipulate ng stock markets nung ginagawa na nila yung gold fraud na pinaunahan ni Michael De Guzman. So ano ba ang ginawa ni Michael De Guzman? Paano siya naging successful sa gold fraud niya? So sabi doon sa mga articles na nabasa ko, wala naman talagang gold doon sa lugar na pinupuntahan nila. Ang ginagawa niya, kumukuha siya ng sample, kumukuha siya ng bato, tapos para syempre may mga magi-investigate nun, tsaka may kakandak ng study about dun sa lupa. Ang ginawa niya para makatakas siya dun and para malagyan niya ng gold, nag-devise siya ng salting. Through the use of his wedding ring, kinaskas niya yung wedding ring niya. Tapos nilagay niya dun sa mga bato na wala naman talagang gold para ipadala for studies and para malaman talaga, ay legit to na may gold. Legit guys, may gold yung ano. Para ba mabigyan niya ng authority and mabigyan ng tamang hinala yung mga tao. So, ayun nga, from 7 pennies sa stock market value in 1993, within 4 years, naging 280 US dollars yung kanilang stock values, which gave the company a 6 billion US dollars. So next slide po. Next slide po. And so collapse of Michael De Guzman. So bakit nga ba siya nag-collapse? Siyempre, yung mayayaman na sila, edi yung government, gusto rin nilang yumaman, parang gusto nilang, hey, hati tayo. So, Ang ginawa nila para mapa-oo yung company ni David Walsh, yung briex company. Nagbigay sila ng parang tinangkang tanggalin yung permit. Kung hindi ka sasali, kung hindi ka may kasama sa amin, tatanggalin ko yung permit nyo dun sa lugar. So, syempre, si Michael De Guzman, 3 steps ahead siya. Sinunod niya lahat ng evidence na maglilid sa kanilang fraud. And sinabi lang niya na aksidente lang yung nangyari na yun. And yung mga tao, okay lang sa kanila. So, pinilit ng government na makipag-deal ang briex sa Freeport-McMoRan share ng 55%. 55% sa government, 45% sa briex. Kung hindi sila, kung dininay nila, tatanggalin nila yung permit and ipapasara nila yung briex. So, gawa nitong situation na to, doon na nila na-expose yung panloloko ng briex at yung panloloko ni Michael De Guzman. So, kaya nila nalaman ito gawa nung pumunta yung Freeport-McMoRan Company dun sa drilling site where De Guzman and the key briex executive attended a mining conference in Toronto. Ay, nagulat sila na wala naman palang gold. Siyempre, tuwan-tuwa sila na papunta sila doon, kukuha sila ng share. E nalaman nila, ordinaryong bato lang pala yung minamay ng mga tao doon. So, next po. Next slide po. Hello? Ayan. Ay, namagpas. Ayan, collapse of Michael De Guzman. So dito, syempre nalaman na nila na fake pala yung pinagagawa nila Michael De Guzman. Pina-order si Michael De Guzman ng government na pumunta sa isang conference with the government. So dito kinuha siya ng Indonesian helicopter and after 20 minutes yung piloto nakarinig siya ng pop and loud bang. And pagtingin niya sa likod, wala na si Michael De Guzman. So allegedly, the manner of death and the cause of death of Michael De Guzman was suicide. Dahil nga tumalon daw siya sa helicopter. Pero what makes this case interesting is kasi after 3 days, nakita yung katawan niya na hindi na unrecognizable na yung katawan. And doon sa kanyang handwritten notes, kaya nasabing suicide, yung mga suicide note daw niya, hindi siya, in-indicate niya na nagpakamatay daw siya kasi nagsasuffer siya sa hepatitis B, which contradicting sa medical documents niya na hindi naman siya ganun ka-serious, hindi pa naman ganun ka-major yung kanyang hepatitis. So, nakita yung katawan niya deep in the swamp of the jungle, laying face down, covered in leeches and maggots. Indonesian police took fingerprints, but authorities in the Philippines had difficulties matching them against documents to a positive identification. So, dito na nagkagulo-gulo yung investigations kasi after how many years after makita yung katawan, yung mga authorities hindi nila pinayagan yung relatives ni Michael De Guzman na tingnan yung katawan kasi nga daw badly decayed na daw and hindi na daw ganun ka-recognizable. Tapos yung isa naman niyang asawa, si Lilis De Guzman, nakita niya yung picture ng katawan and na-convince siya na yun si Michael De Guzman. Kahit na yung mukha niya ay hindi na ma-recognize and may distinct lump daw dun sa shoulder niya. Kaya naniwala siyang patay na. So, si Dr. Daniel Umar, pinatawag siya para mag-conduct ng autopsy. So, the badly decayed body came wrapped in plastic, offering few clues as to what had happened. Internal organs in the chest and abdomen were gone. Many of the bones were broken. Sabi ni Dr. Omar ay wala na daw liver and heart. Baka daw ang possibility nito, kinain daw ng hayop. Pero, contradiction siya kasi within 3 days, possible po ba yun? Pero sinabi nila possible daw. The genitals had disappeared in the decomposition. Others later extrapolated that De Guzman's organs were cut clean off. A 2-hour autopsy led Umar to conclude death was consistent with the fall from a helicopter. So, Indonesian police ruled it as suicide. So, next slide po. So, nakikita niyo po ba ay controversy? The controversy. Hello?
Wait. Doc, pwede pong pa-co-host po ulit. Nawala lang po sa akin yung co-host. Okay na po. Kita na po.
Okay na po. Am I audible?
Yes po.
Rinig po ba? Okay. So, ano po yung mga controversy? Sabi sa isang article made by Alden, Michael De Guzman has been seen in Canada years after the scandal. Sabi naman dahil nga po na hindi inaalaw nung government na ipakita yung katawan ni Michael De Guzman dun sa family, marami nag-speculated ng conspiracies na hindi daw si Michael De Guzman yun. Sabi ng Top Box TV sa YouTube, Indonesia has the easiest way to disappear for a couple of $100 purchase of human corpse. Which nagko-connect dun sa conspiracy na baka nga bumili si Michael De Guzman ng katawan ng tao. Tapos, finake niya yung pagkamatay niya. And sabi ni Simplicio De Guzman, kapatid ni Michael De Guzman, the suicide note is suspect. Teresa's name is shortened to Tess when it is referred to as Tess without an H or Mahal. So dun sa suicide note na nakita nung police, hindi satisfied si Simplicio na suicide note yun ni Michael De Guzman. Kasi nung nagkausap daw sila, walang indication na gusto na magpakamatay ni Michael De Guzman or walang nag-i-indicate na may chance na bigla pala siyang mawawala. Next slide po. Yan. So, yun nga, De Guzman had several wives kasi nga mayaman na siya. Family, pero yung pamilya niya in Manila, yung una niyang pamilya, wala silang nakuhang pera kay De Guzman. Pero 5 years after his death in 2002, yung asawa niya sa Indonesia nakakuha ng mysterious deposit of 100,000 to her bank account and received a call in 2005 to expect to $25,000 is to be deposited to her account and believed, and this reason naniniwala siya na buhay pa si Michael De Guzman. Tulad nga sabi, and Dr. Daniel Omar, sabi niya ay, the autopsy was done not to find out whose body it is, but to justify the way he died. It could be De Guzman is still alive. Kasi iba yung finocus ni Daniel Omar sa pag-autopsy niya. Imbes na i-focus niya kung katawan ba talaga to ni Michael De Guzman, finocus lang niya na kung suicide ba yung or murder. Which nag-conclude naman na suicide. So si Ambassador Abakin, he believed that the body buried was not De Guzman. Kasi nung ito ay dumalaw sa Indonesia, si Ambassador Abakin, para dun sa mga Filipinos na nadi-discriminate ng mga tao doon kasi sa ginawa ni Michael De Guzman. Dito naniwala siya na hindi katawan ni De Guzman yung nalibing kasi ang daming conspiracy na nalabas and ang daming mga elements na nagsasuggest na ibang tao yung nilibing. Gawa ng mga inconsistent information and inconsistent evidence na nakakaduda nga na baka nga ibang tao yung hinulog dun sa helicopter. So next slide po. So Jerome Balyen, he is a Filipino anthropologist and considered as Sherlock Holmes of the Philippines. He theorized that De Guzman was forced to divulge confidential information about Busang, compelled to write his final will and suicide note before being executed. So, kay Jerome Balyan naman, ang kanyang perspective dun sa case ay baka pinatay naman si Michael De Guzman ng government. Siyempre, ikaw ba naman may $4 million tapos nalago pa yun kasi marami ka rin naman nalokong mga investors, marami ka rin nalokong mga tao. Siyempre, tendency ng government, ano yung technique na ginawa mo or nasaan na yung pera na ninakaw mo? Ang kanyang point of view, baka pinatay siya na ginawang suicide kasi gawa nga rin po ng inconsistent information and evidences na binuo nung police at nung nag-investigate. So next slide po. So dun na po pala nagtatapos ang aking discussion. Thank you po and God bless.
So good afternoon po. I am Rosa Sofia Cortina. I will be discussing about dry drowning. So dry drowning, it derives from the division of drowning, which are dry and wet according to the condition of the lungs. So kapag ang isang tao ay nahulog or nagkaroon siya ng accident sa water, human nature na sila ay mag-inhale or mag-gasp for air dahil nagpapanik sila. So, one person, pag nirescue siya sa water, they would assume that the danger is over. However, kapag yung water is nasinghot po through the nose or nakalunok yung tao through the mouth, yung muscles sa windpipe natin can be constrained in order to protect our lungs. So dry drowning is one type of drowning wherein a person takes in a small amount of water through their nose or mouth and it causes a spasm that makes the airway close up. It usually happens after exiting the water and it mainly occurs in children kasi yung mga bata hindi pa naman sila yung tulad natin na meron na tayong instinct na hala may pumasok na water sa body natin. Nakalunok tayo ng water halimbawa ganon. So sa dry drowning po, there are complicating factors that are present, such as there are no early breathing difficulties. So, hindi pa natin agad na papansin na hirap na may water na pala na nakapasok sa system natin. There are also signs ng lack of oxygen, no to very little water in the lungs, and syempre, yun nga po sabi ko, no one else know kung yung person ba ay nakalunok or nakaka-inhale ng liquid or water. Today, doctors realize that a person can die if even a little bit of water enters their lungs. So, a small amount as 2 milliliters of water per kilogram ng body weight natin, yun ay dangerous na po sa ating katawan. Next slide po. So, most medical authorities and organization, dinidiscourage na po nila yung term na dry drowning. Instead, they usually use the term delayed drowning. Pag sinabi na po ngayon na dry drowning, it usually describe cases in which liquid stimulates the voice box and it causes the organ to spasm and shut. So when the voice box spasms, our vocal folds close and breathing becomes difficult. Yung liquid na swallowed natin, they may end up in places where they should not be, such as our sinuses, and mahihirapan na makakuha ng air yung lungs. So here are the signs and symptoms of dry drowning. So throwing up or vomiting, yun po ay sign of stress galing sa body natin as a result of the inflammation and sometimes a lack of oxygen, and also from persistent coughing or gagging, which yung next po nating na symptoms is coughing or persistent coughing, which increases po yung pag-cough para mas ano po yung body natin to breathe. Third po is trouble breathing. Usually po kasi pag bata, hindi naman po nila mai-express yung sarili nila na, hala, parang may nainom po ako na tubig. Ganon. So, kapag nahihirapan na po sila huminga, parang mangangapa po tayo kung ano ba nangyari, bakit po nahihirapan na po huminga yung bata. And losing consciousness, syempre dahil wala na pong air or little air na lang po ang nakakapasok sa body. So, ang dry drowning, it causes the vocal cords to close over the windpipe. So, yung effect po nito ay tinatawag na laryngospasm, which could be mild, causing breathing to become difficult, and it can be severe, preventing any oxygen from getting in or out of the lungs. So, next slide po. Next slide po. So laryngospasm is the closure of the areoepiglottic folds, or the false vocal cords, and the true vocal cords. This reflex responds to the direct laryngeal stimulation from secretions, blood, or foreign body. Laryngospasm may be a reflex designed to prevent accidental drowning or suffocation. So the possibility of a asphyxial death prior to the entry of water must be excluded when it comes to laryngeal spasm. So pag halimbawa ay meron na pong nalulunod na tao, ang nangyayari po sa laryngeal spasm is pine-prevent niya po yung tubig na makapasok sa lungs. However, meron din pong controversy na pinagtatakil about dito dahil ang existence po ng laryngospasm was mentioned in the earliest drowning studies to explain why 10 to 20% of all the dead drowning victims had microscopically dry lungs. From dry drowning, we have the laryngospasm dahil parang one of the effect ng dry drowning or one of the cause ng dry drowning ay yung laryngospasm. Although there are ongoing discussion about the existence of laryngospasm during drowning, it will only be protective in those few patients where the spasm has been activated and is still active at the moment of rescue from the water. Next slide po. So here are the signs and symptoms of laryngospasm. Sudden difficulty breathing with no obvious cause, and the feeling of tightness in the throat. So unlike sa choking, a person experiencing a laryngospasm will not feel something physically lodged sa throat. So hindi po may explain na baka nabubulunan siya or may foreign object na nakapasok sa kanyang throat. So ang ginagawa po kasi ng iba is parang ginagawa po nila yung Heimlich maneuver. However, Heimlich maneuver does not stop as laryngospasm. It would be better if we call the medical authorities para sila yung mag-conduct ng first aid or treatment dun sa person. Next po.
Hello po, ako si Shaina If87. So, death by drinking cold water. Next po. Yan. Three circumstances generally conferred for this disease are death from drinking cold water. First is the patient is extremely warm. Second, the water is extremely cold. And the third is a large quantity of it is suddenly taken into the body. So the danger from drinking the cold water is always in proportion to the degrees of combination which occur in the three circumstances that have been mentioned. So, syempre, if na-experience nyo na yun, yung sobrang init ng panahon, tapos ang palagi nating hinahanap is malamig na tubig. Possible na pag sobrang init na pakiramdam mo, tapos uminom ka ng cold water, ay pwede kang makaranas ng parang maninikip yung dibdib mo, tapos parang mahihirapan ka huminga. And pwedeng mag-contrast yung iyong stomach. Kasi nga, parang mabibigla kasi yung katawan mo. Di ba pag ang mainit na bagay, pag binuhusan mo ng tubig, parang namumuo-muo, tapos biglang So parang ganun din yung may tendency na ganun yung epekto nung pag-inom natin ng malamig na tubig sa pag pakiramdam natin mainit yung katawan natin and pag sobrang init ng panahon. Next po. drinking cold water does affect your body in ways you might not anticipate or want. So, yun nga, drinking lots of cold water when you are hot will give you congestion. Kagaya ng nabanggit ko kanina. There are instances na pag uminom ka ng malamig na tubig, maaring magdilim yung paningin mo, parang bigla ka na lang ma-out of balance. So, 'di ba, parang ang hirap paniwalaan na yung pag-inom mo lang ng tubig is pwedeng malaking epekto yung pangyayari sa katawan mo. Next po. So, sudden death after cold drink. So, there's a case po na yung 12 years old na bata after rapid ingestion of a frozen slurry drink, the cause of death was determined to be a cardiac arrhythmia secondary to a previously undiagnosed cardiac rhabdomyoma with associated myocardial scarring. So, yun po. Sa case po na ito, yung bradycardia influenced by cold-induced vasovagal reflex po. Yun, pagkainom niya nung frozen slurry drink, nahirapan siya huminga, nag-tighten yung way, yung sa may esophagus niya, ganon. And yun nga, pag ikaw ay may sakit, kadalasan mas madalas ka maapektuhan pag yung nakakapag-ingest ka ng cold liquid sa iyong katawan. So, maaari siyang mag-lead sa fatal cardiac arrhythmias nga po. Yun po. Next po. So, yan. Alcohol intoxication can cause drowning easily. Yan. Approximately 2/3 of adult males found drowning have consumed alcohol. Next po. Yan. Alcohol intoxication is serious. It affects your body temperature, breathing, heart rate, and gag reflex. It can also sometimes lead to coma or death. So, the symptoms of alcohol intoxication range from mild to severe is depende kung gaano karami yung na-take mo na alcohol. And kung paano metabolize ng katawan mo yung alak na na-intake mo. So, yun po. Next slide po. So, yan. Psychological effects of alcohol have potential to increase the risk of immersion injury for persons involved in swimming and other water-related activity because they increase the likelihood of exposure to high-risk situation and the harm that might result by affecting cognitive processing, central nervous system processing, and psychological process. So yun nga, if yung tao ay nakainom, parang malakas ang loob nila eh. Parang nagte-take sila ng challenge. Kasi nga, dahil hindi nagpa-process ng ayos yung utak nila, and possible dahil apekto yun ng alak, ng alcohol intoxication, hindi nakakapag-isip ng tama yung taong nakainom. So, hindi nila naiisip yung mga tendency ng activities na ginagawa nila. Lalo na pag ito ay sa swimming din. And syempre, pag nakainom ka, di ba, kadalasan na nagiging epekto nito is naliliyo tayo, na-out of balance tayo, minsan nahihirapan tayo huminga, o kaya hindi natin naririnig ng ayos yung sinasabi ng tao. So, naapektuhan talaga nito yung katawan natin and yung way of thinking natin. Next po. Yan. Cranberry singer or Jordan drowned due to alcohol intoxication. So, si Dolores O'Riordan ay isang lead singer of Irish rock, yung kumanta ng zombie, something like that. Siya ay nalunod sa kanyang bathtub kasi siya ay lasing. Tapos, nandoon siya sa bathtub niya. So, nasubmerge siya doon sa kanyang bathtub and natagpuan na lang siya na patay doon sa kanyang bathtub. Next po. So, what is hypoglycemia and hypothermia? Hypoglycemia causes sudden weakness, confusion, and affects the body normal temperature. So, medical researchers warn that alcohol and aquatic exercise without taking sufficient carbohydrates represent a foolish confrontation with death. So, and ang hypothermia naman ay yun yung drop in the body's core temperature. Sa tubig na merong 60 degrees, nagiging sluggish yung swimmer o yung taong naliligo. In that case, dahil nga sa alcohol na naapektuhan nito yung ating body system, yung swimmer ay hindi aware o kadalasan wala siyang idea kung gaano na yung pagka-chill ng katawan niya yung nararamdaman. Kasi 'di ba, pag umiinom tayo parami yung inom natin ng alak, mas painit ng painit yung pakiramdam natin. So 'yon, kadalasan nga ang nagiging cause ng pagkamatay is yun nga, sa hyperthermia dahil pagkalunod nga. Yun po. Next. Yan, alcohol can heighten the risk of drowning because dahil sa impairs judgment. Yan, alcohol distorts the perception of risk and one's abilities. Kagaya ng sinabi ko kanina, dahil nga sa alak, lumalakas ang loob ng tao and hindi na niya naiisip yung mga possible results na ite-take niyang action dahil nga sa apekto ng alak. Yan, increases risk-taking behavior. Alcohol removes inhibitions, tao. Na kunyari, ang tao, di ba tayo kadalasan sinasabi natin, inom lang ako, kukuha lang ako ng lakas ng loob. Di ba? Ganun kadalasan sinasabi ng tao. Pero, yun nga, kagaya ng dito, sa pag nakaka-intake ka ng alcohol. Isang example, pag inuudyo ka kunwari, may magkakabarkada, inuudyo ka ng friend mo na, hala, sige nga, talon ka nga dyan, mababaw lang naman yan. Nandoon sila mag-cliff diving sila. Ikaw, dahil nga nakainom ka na, marami ka nang nainom, iti-take mo yung risk, tatalon ka doon. Syempre, ikaw ay nakainom, and naapektuhan na ng alak yung katawan mo, yung pag-process ng utak mo, and yung sa body system mo nga, mahihirapan ka lumangoy. Possible, mahirapan ka din huminga. And yan, reduced coordination. Alcohol numbs the senses, particularly sight, sound, and touch, leading to unsteadiness and inability to climb or swim, making it hard to get out of trouble. Ayun nga, di ba? Pag ang taong laseng, kahit nasa 3 feet lang yan ng swimming pool or 2 feet lang yan ng swimming pool, pwede pa rin yan malunod. Bakit? Kasi nga, siya ay lasing-lasing, may alcohol intoxication nga siya. So, ang nangyayari nga, super out of balance siya, hindi na niya nakokontrol yung function ng katawan niya. Na minsan akala niya na hawak na siya dun sa dulo ng pool, pero hindi pala. Malalampas lang yung kamay niya, babagsak lang sa tubig. Yon, impairs reaction time. Alcohol is a depressant, reducing the rate the brain processes information. In water emergencies where response time are vital, it can prove the difference between life and death. Ayun, 'di ba minsan pag nagliligo tayo, hindi na natin napapansin yung iba nating mga kasamahan na akala natin okay lang yun doon kasi nakatayo lang naman siya doon sa sulok ng swimming pool. Pero yung taong yun pala ay lasing na lasing. Ngayon, syempre, kampante kayo na nakatayo lang yung taong yun doon sa dulo na pool. Hindi nyo alam na siya na pala ay possible na malunod kasi nga siya ay lunod na sa alak. And because of that, posibleng hindi na siya makahingi ng tulong once na siya ay nalulunod na. Tendency na maaring maging ikamatay niya. So, the last is hypothermia. In cold situation, the body will attempt to draw blood away from the limbs. So, yun nga. Yun nga po. Next po.
Hello, good afternoon. I am Daniela Blanco and now I will report about the tsunami. So, ano nga ba ang tsunami? A tsunami is a series of waves caused by earthquakes or undersea volcanic eruptions. Out in the depths of the ocean, tsunami waves do not dramatically increase in height, but as the waves travel inland, they build up to a higher and higher heights as the depth of the ocean decreases. Ang ibig sabihin nito na kapag daw yung depths of the ocean, wait lang po, nag-feedback po, wait lang po. Ayan, okay na po. So ang ibig sabihin nito na yung depths of the ocean daw is indirectly proportional dun sa height ng tsunami waves. Ibig sabihin, kapag nag-increase yung depth of the ocean, magdi-decrease naman yung height ng tsunami waves. While kapag naman nag-increase yung height ng tsunami waves, magdi-decrease yung depths of the ocean. Ang ibig sabihin, sa paglalim ng karagatan, maliit lamang yung height ng tsunami waves. Pero as long as medyo bumababaw na ito or lumalapit na ito sa coastline, doon unti-unting lumalaki yung height ng tsunami waves. Also, the speed of tsunami waves depends on the ocean depth rather than the distance from the source of the wave. So yung speed daw o yung bilis ng tsunami is nakadepende kung gaano kalalim ang karagatan at hindi doon sa distance from the origin. Tsunami waves may travel as fast as jet planes over deep waters, only slowing down when reaching shallow waters. Unlike dun sa nauna na kapag malalim is mas maliit yung tsunami waves, ito naman kapag malalim mas mabilis yung tsunami waves. At kapag naman mababaw na, doon unti-unting babagal yung tsunami waves. Madalas, tinatawag natin yung tsunami waves na tidal waves. Pero ang sabi ng oceanographers, dinidiscourage nila ito. Kasi ang tides daw have little to do with these giant waves o dito nga sa mga tsunami. So enough with the definition of tsunami. Pupunta naman tayo sa adverse impacts of tsunami. Merong different adverse impacts on tsunami. The effects of tsunami on a coastline can range from unnoticeable to devastating. Maaaring hindi natin mananotice yung effect ng tsunami, pero maaari namang napaka-devastating ng impacts nito sa atin. The effects of tsunami depend on the characteristic of the seismic event that generated the tsunami. Merong tatlo. First is the distance from its point of origin. Second is the size or yung magnitude. And third is the configuration of the bathymetry or yung depth of the ocean along the coast that the tsunami is approaching. Small tsunamis are non-destructive and undetectable without specialized equipment. Hindi natin siya napapansin yung mga small tsunamis unless may specialized equipment tayo. It happens almost every day. So, di ba hindi naman natin nalaman na may araw-araw palang maaaring magkaroon ng tsunami. Ito ay resulta ng minor earthquakes or other events na nangyayari underwater. they are very often too far away from the land or they are too small to have an effect when they hit the shore. So maaaring sobrang layo nito sa coastline or maaari namang sobrang liit nitong tsunami kaya hindi natin ito na-notice. When a small tsunami comes to the shoreline, it is often indicated as pwedeng fast-moving tide lamang or strong-moving tide. Parang napapansin natin siya na akala natin is fast-moving tide lamang siya, pero tsunami na pala siya. Masyado lang siyang maliit o masyado lang malayo sa coastline or yung origin, kaya ganun yung nakikita natin. However, when tsunami waves become extremely large in height, they savagely attack the coastline, causing devastating property damage and loss of life. A small wave, yung small wave na kasing liit lamang ng 30 centimeters yung height, in the deep ocean, maaari siyang lumaki into a monster wave or into a giant wave na 30 meters yung height as it sweeps over the seashore. Imagine 30 centimeters magiging 30 meters yung height. The effects can be further amplified where a bay, harbor, or lagoon funnels the waves as they move inland. Large tsunamis have been known to rise over 100 feet. So yung mga malalaking tsunamis, maaari siyang umabot into 100 feet. So with this, iano naman natin, ano ba yung adverse impact pag nagkaroon ng large tsunami dun sa hazard zone? First is destruction. The amount of energy and water contained in a huge tsunami can cause extreme destruction when it strikes inland. The initial wave of a huge tsunami is extremely tall. However, most damage is not sustained by this wave. Most of the damage is caused by a huge mass of water behind the initial wave front. As the height of the sea keeps rising fast and floods powerfully into the coastal area. It is the power behind the waves, the endless rushing water that causes devastation and loss of life. When the giant breaking waves of a tsunami batter the shoreline, they can destroy everything in their path. So with this rushing water, yung force na hahampas into the coastline, yun yung magde-destroy ng kahit na anong matamaan niya across the path, even miles. So there are two mechanisms kung paano nakakapag-destroy ng properties ang tsunami. First is yung smashing force of a wall of water, or yun yung sinasabi ko ng force or yung paghampas. And second is yung destructive power of a large volume of water or yung pagbabaha na yung malaking pagbabaha dun sa affected area. So objects and buildings are destroyed by the sheer weight of the water, often reduced to skeletal foundations and exposed bedrock. Large objects such as ships and boulders can be carried several miles inland before the tsunami subsides. So imagine yung ship, kaya niyang dalhin miles from its origin. Ganun kalakas yung force, ganun kalakas yung flooding nung tsunami. The buildings infrastructure, yung lalo na kapag dahil nga nasa Pacific Ring of Fire tayo, tsunamis may have dramatic consequences, lalo na dun sa less developed countries. The buildings, infrastructure in these poorer nations are not well built and cannot withstand the impact of tsunami. So since medyo kulang sa budget yung nation na yon, maaaring hindi well built yung mga infrastructure, kung kaya hindi nito nakakayanan yung impact ng tsunami. Whole areas and towns are a picture of destruction as the tsunami leaves a trail devastation and misery behind it. Second is death. One of the biggest and worst effects of a tsunami is the cost to human life, cause unfortunately escaping a tsunami is nearly impossible. So, yung pag-escape daw sa tsunami is nearly impossible, pero hindi siya Hindi siya imposible talaga, nearly impossible lamang. Imagine, hundreds and thousands of people are killed by tsunami. Imagine, nung 1850 alone, tsunamis have been responsible for the loss of more than 430,000 lives. 430,000 lives yung nakuha ng tsunami 1850 pa lamang. There is a very little warning before the tsunami hits land. So may mga little warning kagaya ng earthquake, merong different signs na matatalakay mamaya. As the water rushes towards the land, it leaves a very little time to map an escape plan. People living in coastal regions, towns, and villages may have no time to escape. The violent force of tsunami results in instant death. So ano nga ba yung main cause or yung common cause kung bakit namamatay ang mga tao sa tsunami? It is because of our topic, drowning. According to World Health Organization, drowning ang common cause ng death as an impact of tsunami. Secondary pa lang yung mga nagko-collapse na building, electrocution, yung pag-explode ng gases, yung damaged tanks, or yung floating debris. Yon, another cause of death pa lang yon. Pero ang pinaka-common at pinaka-maraming ang namatay is due to our topic, drowning. Another example is the tsunami of December 2004 that struck Southeast Asia and East Africa. Imagine, killed over 31,000 people only in Sri Lanka and leaving 23,000 injured individuals. So, aside from death, meron din, maaari ding magkaroon ng disease yung iba't ibang tao due to tsunami. Tsunami waves and the receding water are very destructive. The areas close to the coast are flooded with seawater, damaging the infrastructure such as sewage and freshwater supplies for drinking. Flooding and contamination of drinking water can cause disease to spread in the tsunami hit areas. Illnesses such as malaria arise when water is stagnant and contaminated. Under these conditions, it is difficult for people to stay healthy and for diseases to be treated. So infections, yon. Because of the flooding and contamination, nagkakaroon ng infection and illnesses and madali itong may spread, causing additional death as an adverse impact of tsunami. Next is environmental impacts. Tsunamis not only destroy human life but have a devastating effects on insects, animals, plants, and natural resources. A tsunami changes the landscape. It uproots trees and plants and destroys animal habitats such as nesting sites of birds. Land animals are also killed by drowning, and sea animals are killed by pollution if dangerous chemicals are washed away into the sea, thus poisoning the marine life. Contamination of soil and water is the second key environmental impact of a tsunami. Salination of water bodies such as rivers, wells, groundwater aquifers can occur in most cases. This also affects the soil fertility and agricultural lands due to salination and debris contamination. Sewage and septic tanks and toilets are damaged, contaminating the water supply. Last but not the least, definitely not the least, is yung environmental impact is yung radiation resulting from the damage to nuclear plants as it happened in Japan in March 2011. So, maaring madamage din due to tsunami ang nuclear plants. Since radiation exists for a long time, it has the capacity to inflict damage upon anything exposed to it. Kabilang na dito yung animals, yung other living things, also humans, causing destruction as molecules lose their electrons. The damage caused by radiation to the DNA structure determines birth defects, cancers, and even death. Next is yung cost naman. Massive cost hit communities and nations when a tsunami happens. Victims and survivors of tsunami need immediate help from the rescue teams. So, syempre, tutulungan ng governments, tutulungan ng governments, magkakaroon ng different projects yung government para matulungan yung victims and yung survivors. And ayun nga, governments around the world may help with the cost of bringing aid to devastated areas. National institutions and United Nations, other international organizations, community groups, and non-governmental organizations, and a variety of other entities come together to provide different kinds of aid. So, ang magastos dito is yung reconstruction and yung pag-clean up sa tsunami. Next is the psychological effects of tsunami. Victims of tsunami events often suffer psychological problems which can last for days, years, and also entire lifetime. Survivors of Sri Lankan tsunami of December 2004 were found to have PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder when examined by WHO. These people were suffering from grief and depression as their homes, yung businesses nila, and also yung mga nawala nilang loved ones. Ayun. And many still had PTSD according to research. So, next is yung Indian Ocean on Boxing Day 2004. It is a case of tsunami. Ito ay example ng tsunami event. The Boxing Day tsunami in 2004 is believed to be the deadliest tsunami in history. It hit the coast of several countries of South and Southeast Asia in December 2004. The tsunami and its aftermath were responsible for immense destruction and loss on the rim of the Indian Ocean. So, ano nga ba ang nangyari rito sa Indian Ocean tsunami noong 2004? On December 26, 2004 at 7:59 a.m. local time, an undersea earthquake with a magnitude of 9.1 struck off the coast of Indonesian island of Sumatra. Over the next 7 hours, so kung 7:59 to 59, a tsunami, a series of immense ocean waves triggered by the quake reached out across the Indian Ocean. So nagkaroon ng tsunami due dun sa tectonic activity na nangyari nung 7:59 a.m. Some locations reported that the waves had reached a height of 30 feet or 9 meters or more when they hit the shoreline. The tsunami killed at least 225,000 people across a dozen countries, with Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, Maldives, and Thailand sustaining massive damage. So, ito yung mga pinaka naapektuhan nung Indian Ocean tsunami. Indonesian officials estimated that the death toll there alone ultimately exceeded 200,000. So sa Indonesia pa lamang 200,000 na, particularly in northern Sumatra province. Tens of thousands were reported dead or missing in Sri Lanka and India, a large of them from the Indian Andaman and Nicobar Islands territory. The low-lying island country of Maldives reported more than 100 casualties and immense economic damage. So, meron pa. Siyempre, after ng tsunami, meron pa nga mga adverse impact yung tsunami or yung parang aftermath yung ng tsunami. The lack of food, clean water, and medical treatment combined with enormous tasks faced by relief workers trying to get supplies into some remote areas where roads had been destroyed and where civil war rage extended the list of casualties. So, aside from sa effect ng tsunami, aside from tsunami, is marami ring namatay sa gutom, sa uhaw, or lack of water sanitation, and mga hindi, though nakasurvive sila sa tsunami, hindi naman nagamot or hindi naman sila nabigyan ng treatment kung kaya't namatay rin sila. And also, long-term environmental damage was severe as well as with villages, tourist resorts, farmland, and fishing ground demolished and inundated with the debris, bodies, and plant-killing salt water. So, ayun ang nangyari sa Indian Ocean on Boxing Day 2004. It is quite terrifying. It is quite scary, yung tsunami. Pero, according to science, maaari tayo makasurvive sa tsunami. According to empirical research, maaari tayo makasurvive sa tsunami. So, let me leave this on your imagination. Imagine, you are on a beach. Tapos, wala, nagliliwaliw ka lang, wala kang iniisip. And then, yung parang nagpapa-tan skin ka lang, tapos ini-enjoy mo yung sand, tapos tinitingnan mo yung sound, ay parang pinapakinggan mo yung sound of the waves, and then, biglang nakita mo, umurong yung water, nag-recede yung water. Lumayo yung water sa'yo. And nakita mo na, yun nga, umurong. Better act quickly because in a matter of minutes, kapag hindi ka pa umalis doon, you may be underwater. And here's how to survive a tsunami according to science. Kagaya ng sabi ko kanina, tsunamis are triggered by intense underwater activity, usually earthquake or underwater volcanic eruption. These events displace huge volumes of water, pushing it up from the ocean's floor to its origin. But when gravity pulls it back down, all this built-up energy is released outwards, forming deadly waves that grow stronger as they ripple across the ocean. So ang tsunami, maaari siyang maging 100 kilometers long and 30 meters high. Tapos, kasing bilis nga siya ng jet airplane kung mag-travel. So with such speed, with such force, with such strength, with such stamina, how does anyone stand a chance against a tsunami? Even in a tsunami hazard zone, you can still survive if you know what to do. The first step to survival is to be able to identify the early signs of tsunami. Kailangan alam mo kung ano yung different signs of tsunami. So ano nga ba yung different size na to? In most cases, an earthquake comes before a tsunami. So if you're near the coast and you've experienced an earthquake, halimbawa nag-earthquake, wag muna naman kayong tatakbo agad ay na parang nag-earthquake tapos malapit ako sa coast, ako'y tatakbo na. Habang yumayanig pa ang lupa, ay nagbabagsakan pa ang mga infrastructures. Nagbabagsakan pa yung iba't ibang materials. Wag muna. Ang kailangan, unahin mo, you must protect yourself first dun sa earthquake. And then, once the shaking stops, you must move to higher grounds as quickly as possible. Next is stay away from the coastline. That is away. And then, the beach will grow bigger. Run the other way around. So, aalis kayo from the coastline. An early sign of an impending tsunami is that water along the coast will recede. So, uuro nga yung water. It pulls back and exposes the seafloor. Do not go. Pag umurong yung water, wag na kayong bida-bida na, ay, wow, maraming starfish, maraming seashells. Ay, ano kaya ang nangyari? Bakit umurong yung water? Maimbestigahan ngayon. Do not go to the beach to investigate or to get some seashells. You'll only be putting yourself at risk for when the water surges back. Instead, pumunta na agad kayo sa opposite direction. Try to get as far as 3.5 kilometers from the ocean or 30 meters above the sea level to ensure your safety. Next is seek higher ground. Get to the highest elevation as possible. So sa bilis ng tsunami, maaaring hindi na kayo makalayo. If ever, in this case, look for a tall building. Pero you must make sure na sturdy concrete foundation. Kailangan matibay. If you see one nearby, run inside, get to the get to the roof as quickly as possible. And if you can't make it to the building in time, doon naman papasok tong pang-apat natin. Grab onto something and hold on. Your best pad is to grab onto something and hold on. Though this may not sound very practical, pero kayo ay magmasid muna sa paligid nyo. Kung ano yung pwede nyong hawakan or kung pwede nyong gamitin para magpalutang-lutang. In 2004, Indian Ocean tsunami, yung example ko kanina, an Indonesian woman was finally rescued after holding onto a palm tree for 5 days straight. So humawak lang siya dun sa palm tree, nakasurvive siya 5 days straight. Ayan, sorry. And then, well, it isn't ideal to find something to hold on to kasi nga yung tsunami is nagsisweep tons of debris along with it and dangerous and maaari kang madala nung sa agos. Pero many victims have been saved by climbing onto detached roof or holding on tightly on floating cars or other large objects. And kapag umabot ka na, halimbawa, nakasurvive ka na, it's not yet over till it's over. If you've made this far, your troubles are not over yet. A tsunami isn't one wave, but a series of waves known as tsunami wave train. Waves may be anywhere from 5 minutes apart to an hour apart, and be aware that yung first wave, hindi siya yung pinakamalakas or maaaring siya pinakamalakas pero hindi palagi. So even when you think it's over na, tapos na, kalmado na, stay where you are or kung saan ka safe until sabihin ng mga local officials na, okay, tapos na. And when 30-meter wave is hurtling towards you, and you know na tsunamis are very terrifying. Imagine 30-meter wave papunta, 30-meter na height ng wave papunta sa iyo, tapos ang bilis 800 kilometers per hour. Maaaring kayo ay parang hopeless na or hindi na alam kung anong magagawin, nagpapanik na. But you must have faith in science. You must have faith in empirical research, and you'll see na there's a way out. So next topic is yung biblical history of drowning. And ang napili kong biblical history of drowning is the crossing of the Red Sea. Crossing of the Red Sea is recounted in the Old Testament, Exodus 14 verses 19 to 31. So ano nga ba ang nangyari sa crossing the Red Sea? So isa-summarize ko na lang siya. After suffering devastating plagues sent by God, the Pharaoh of Egypt decided to let the Hebrew people go as Moses had asked. So sinabi ni Moses na palayain na yung Hebrews from slavery. And pumayag naman itong si Pharaoh kasi nga nakaranas na siya ng different plagues sent by God. God told Moses he would get glory over Pharaoh and prove that the Lord is God. After the Hebrews left Egypt, the king changed his mind. Biglang nagbago yung kanyang isip at nagalit siya kasi nawala na siya ng source of slave labor. Wala na siyang aalipinin. So, bigla siyang nagpatawag ng 600 best chariots, all other chariots in the land, and marched his massive army in pursuit. So pinatawag niya yung kanyang pinakamalalakas na army at pinasunod dun sa Hebrew people. The Israelites seemed to be trapped. Mountains stood on one side, and then the other side naman, or yung in front of them, is the Red Sea. When they saw Pharaoh's soldier coming, they were terrified. Natakot yung mga Israelitas nung nakita nila na papalapit na yung soldiers na pinadala ng Pharaoh. And sinisi nila si God and si Moses. Sinabi nila na, Mas mabuti pa na alipinin na lang kami kesa mamatay kami dito sa disyerto. But Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see them again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." So yun yung sabi ni Moses para pakalmahin yung mga Israelites. The angel of God in the pillar of cloud stood between the people and the Egyptians, protecting the Hebrews. Then Moses stretched his hand out over the sea. So in-stretch ni Moses yung kanyang kamay, and the Lord caused a strong east wind to blow all the night, parting the waters and turning the seafloor into the dry land. So yun, pinart nga yung water or yung Red Sea. During the night, the Israelites fled through the Red Sea, a wall of water to their right and to their left. So ayun nga, parang pinamamagitan sila ng wall of waters. The Egyptian army charged in after them. Watching the chariots raced ahead, God threw the army into a panic, clogging their chariot wheels to slow them down. Once the Israelites were safe on the other side, God commanded Moses to stretch out his hand again. As morning returned, the sea rolled back again. Ayun, pagka pinataas ulit ni God yung kamay ni Moses, and biglang bumalik sa dati yung sea, at doon na cover or nalunod, na drown yung Egyptian army, its chariots and horses, and wala nang ibang nakasurvive. Nalunod na silang lahat. Though after witnessing this great miracle, the people believed in the Lord and his servant Moses. So yun lamang ang nangyari sa crossing the Red Sea.
Hello po, I'm Christine Darada. I'm going to discuss po the format of medico-legal report on drowning. So one of the most well-known cases for drowning ay yung case ni Whitney Houston. We are all aware na naman po sa case ni Whitney Houston since we had an activity about it nung meron pa tayong forensic toxicology. Pero I'll briefly discuss the case po para ma-recap po natin yung nangyari sa death ni Whitney Houston. Next slide po. So Whitney Houston was found dead in a bathtub in Beverly Hills Hilton Hotel room just before the Grammy Awards in 2012. Her assistant entered her room, and when she walked into the bathroom, she found Whitney face down in a foot of water in the tub. They immediately administered CPR and told the switchboard to call 911. Then the police investigator found plates of food, a bottle of beer, and an open bottle of champagne. Tapos sa bathroom counter ay may nakita silang spoon and white crystal-like substance. So in order to find out the real cause of Whitney Houston's death, they performed an autopsy. Dito po, medyo malabo lang. Makikita natin yung final autopsy ni Whitney Houston. So, yan yung yung medical legal report based on her case. Makikita natin na nakalagay yung details kung sino yung ni-autopsy, pati na rin yung complete date, time, at kung saan naganap yung pag-autopsy sa body. Ayan yung example, nakalagay na I performed an autopsy on the body of Whitney Houston at the Department of Coroner, Los Angeles, California on February 12, 2012. Sa baba naman yan, makikita yung cause of death based from the anatomic findings and pertinent history, which is drowning due to effects of atherosclerotic heart disease and cocaine use. Sa baba naman yan ay makikita yung mga naka-indicate na anatomical summary. Next slide. Diyan makikita natin na included rin yung circumstance ng death, pati na rin yung mga external examination na ginawa sa body ni Whitney, pati na rin yung mga evidence injuries na nakita ng coroners. Next slide po. Diyan naman po sa part na yan ng head and neck ng autopsy niya, dito napatunayan na may signs of drowning. 'Di ba? Yung large amounts of froth present in nostrils and mouth in freshly drowned bodies, hyperinflated and congested lungs and fluid in the paranasal sinuses or stomach ay mga signs ng drowning. Dito sa autopsy ni Whitney, naka-indicate yung mga injuries na naging proof to conclude that there is a perforation of the posterior nasal septum at congestion of the right colon. So yun yung dalawang anatomical signs na nagpatunay or naging evidence na drowning due to effects of cocaine use ang cause of death niya. And then meron din sa part ng autopsy na naka-indicate yung mga systemic and organ review ng katawan ni Whitney. Doon naman ni-discuss yung mga findings na nakita sa bawat organ system ni Whitney. As in like lahat, like respiratory, gastrointestinal, cardiovascular, at iba pang organ system niya. Nakalagay din sa autopsy na yun yung mga report like toxicology report, special procedure, pati na rin yung mga photography na ginawa sa body niya. Next slide po. Yan po yung last page ng autopsy report ni Whitney. Diyan po nakalagay yung opinion nung nag-autopsy ng body niya. Diyan nakalagay din yung dito sa case ni Whitney, ni-conclude ng medical examiner na walang foul play sa death ni Whitney and ang manner of death niya ay accident. And ang naging cause of death niya ay due to drowning with the effects of atherosclerotic heart disease and cocaine use. Tapos ayan, may mga pirma ng mga medical examiner at chief forensic medicine for the validity and authenticity ng document or medical legal report. Next po. Ang last topic po ng report namin ay yung vapor sa Visayas. So, the sinking of the ferry following a collision with cargo ship is the latest of many deadly accidents to have overwhelmed in the Philippines sea transport industry. Ang inter-island ferries ay isa sa mga naging main forms of transportation ng mga Pilipino dahil mas mura ito kaysa sa mga airfare travel. Kaso dahil sa mga bad weather, lalo na kapag typhoon season sa Pilipinas, pati na rin dahil sa poor maintenance, overloading of vessels, and careless enforcement of safety regulation, naglalad ito to many disaster. One of the most famous incident ng vapor sa Visayas ay ang MV Dona Paz, na mas kinikilala as Asia's Titanic. On the night of December 20, 1987, the 2,250-ton MV Dona Paz was sailing through Tabla Strait of Mindoro Oriental on its way to Manila on a trip that started from Tacloban, Leyte, that from Tacloban, Leyte, carrying passengers from Samar and Leyte and various areas from the southern Philippines who were hoping na makasama ang kanilang pamilya, while the others is hoping to bring their families to the big city in the time of Christmas holiday. It manifest listed 1,493 passengers and a 53-member crew, but survivors' accounts showed that the vessel was carrying more than 4,000 passengers, more than twice its declared capacity of 1,518 passengers and 60 crew members. Based on listed passengers alone, the ship was already loaded beyond its capacity, and dapat hindi na ito ni allowed to proceed by the Coast Guard or the shipping line and its crew. Yung mga survivors ay dinescribe na yung ship is packed to the railings, 4 deep in the bunks with no place to move in the common areas. Others naman claim na the ship was visibly nakatagilid na to one side even before it's left its moorings in Tacloban, which is a visual statement na yung ship ay nasa state na ng overloading. Sinasabi rin na madami daw bata na nakasakay dun sa Dona Paz na hindi nakalista sa passenger list. Kasi 'di ba, parang uso yung pagbili ng mga tickets sa mga scalpers. Yon. Next slide po. Sailing through the strait was the 629-ton steel-hulled Vector, which was transporting 9,000 barrels of fuel products, including gasoline, kerosene, and oil from Bataan to Masbate. The vessel had 13 members. The most senior navigator on deck serving as captain was a seafarer with license of second mate. The crew, as is customary during long holidays in the Philippines, was already in the festive mood, drinking and merrymaking during the trip. Despite a clear night and fine weather, the two vessels, Vector and the Dona Paz, crossed paths at around 10:30 p.m. at Dumali Point of the coast of Mindoro Oriental. Evidence gathered by subsequent inquiries conclude that the Vector rammed the port side of the Dona Paz, immediately disabling the engine and setting the two ships on fire. Only 26 people were rescued and 24 passengers of Dona Paz and 2 members lang ng Vector. Much of what happened can be reconstructed and those within the vicinity of the incident. Yung mga gising nung time nung incident ay nakarinig ng explosion that jarred the Dona Paz. Isa sa mga survivors claimed to have just talked to the captain and the chief mates of the Dona Paz who were drinking liquor at a party on the bridge a few minutes before the explosion. Upon ocean turned into a sea flames, many of those who survived can only recall jumping into the water, leaving behind the people wailing and screaming in pain. Next slide po. The ferry sank within 2 hours of the collision, while the tanker sank within 4 hours. Both ships sank in about 545 meters of shark-infested waters. It reportedly took 8 hours before Philippine maritime authorities learned of the accident, and another 8 hours to organize such search and rescue operation. Fortunately, may dumaan dun sa incident na isa pang barko, yung MV Don Claudio, a cargo ship flying a route bringing it close to the scene of collision. Witness the explosion and the ball of fire lighting up the sky. They reached the scene within a few hours of the collision pero hindi nila nakita yung dalawang ship kasi lumubog na ito. Ang tanging nakita na lang nila ay yung mga debris around the ocean and they search for survivors. Sila yung nag-rescue dun sa 26 na survivors. And yung mga survivors na yun ay most of them suffered from second-degree burns when they plunged into the fiery waters after both ships explode. Ito pong incident na to ay na-recognize as the world worst peacetime shipping disaster kasi halos 4,300 na tao yung namatay sa incident na to. Sila ay namatay dahil sa drowning or die by burning. Ang incident po na ito ay saltwater drowning. The seawater is hypertonic to plasma. Ang mechanism ng saltwater drowning gaya sa incident ng MV Dona Paz, ang unang process niya ay inhalation of water into the respiratory tract while crying, screaming for help in the process of drowning. Due to higher saline content of water, kasi nga salt water siya, fluid or the plasma is drawn from the circulation and enters the alveolar spaces, thus proceeding hemoconcentration in the pulmonary circulation and massive pulmonary edema. Due to the hemoconcentration, red blood cells get crenated. Hemoconcentration and crenation of red blood cells lead to myocardial anoxia. Tapos, yung death nito ay nagre-range between 8 to 12 minutes. Next slide po. It was also reported that forensic doctors from the National Bureau of Investigation and Interpol were waiting in Cebu City to attempt identification. However, some people from Mindoro were forced to bury the people who died in the incident without having them identified to prevent them from rotting near houses lining the shore. Also, a little over 500 bodies were subsequently recovered by the Philippine Coast Guard and many were left unidentified. The true number of casualties to this day remains unknown as thousands remain entombed in the Dona Paz and its environs. Diyan po nagtatapos yung report po namin. Thank you po.
Thank you po.